Hello and welcome to Property TV. My name's Stephen Galpin and this is Property Matters Budget Special. With me today are John Howard. John, welcome.
Thank you.
John's a developer, regular panellist on Property TV's programmes. And also joining John is Andy Wood of ETC Tax. Andy, welcome to you too.
Hi there, how are you doing?
Good. Gents, I think the easiest way to perhaps format our programme is to say, John, first of all, what were the headlines that caught you in the budget?
Well, of course, housing is why we're sitting here, really, isn't it, in a way, and commercial. So we all knew what was coming, probably, but I'm delighted it has come. 95% guaranteed mortgages for first-time buyers. They've only got to find a 5% deposit. That will level up the playing field with the new homes, which has the existing scheme on it. So that's really good news. Stamp duty being delayed for another few months and then tapered after that, I think is very sensible of Rishi, and everyone was speaking to him about that. I certainly spoke to my MP about it, Tom Hunt, and a lot of other people did as well, and I'm glad he's listened to us.
Okay. Andy, for you, what were the headlines for you?
I think I agree with John regarding the significance of the stamp duty holiday, which I think was, like most of the substantive measures in the budget, was leaked to the newspapers 2 weeks ago. But I do think that that's helpful. As John mentioned, the 500,000 limit is extended to the end of June, but then we kind of have this sort of halfway house until the end of September, where it's a 250,000 threshold before reverting to the 125 from October. But I think, I suppose other thing that I suppose particularly residential landlords who I think we've seen a bit of a stampede towards corporate structures for landlords due to sort of restriction on interest relief, which we've talked about sort of ad nauseum. There's perhaps something for those individuals to bear in mind, with the corporation tax rise has been slated from April 2023 onwards, potentially with a top rate of 25%, where your profits are over £50,000.
Yes. Andy, I read a lot in the property press that, well, in past years and on our programmes, we've had many experts say to us, yep, get yourself a corporate structure, put your buy-to-let into a limited company, perhaps ring-fence it. It's easier to control. It's economic in terms of tax and everything else. And yet now I see those same pundits saying, whatever you do, don't go into a limited company. It's so difficult once you're in, and when you try and come out, it's terribly complex, I know. But what's your feeling? Is it better to have this corporate structure around you on buy-to-let?
Well, I think it's important when you're looking at anything. First and foremost, it's a case-by-case basis, and secondly, and I don't shout this too loud, but tax also isn't the most important thing in the world. But if you look at it purely from a tax point of view, and you're running a substantial property business, and I suppose I rather technically refer it to as you're running it as a proper business, so you're reinvesting sort of surplus profits back into the portfolio, then clearly doing that after corporation tax rather than after personal tax, which is much higher. That seems to make sense to me. And even with these changes, I mean, for the full 25% rate to bite from April 2023, you're going to have to be making profits of £250,000.
Can I stop, Andy? Can I just stop you there a minute? Because at the end of the day, that's the one thing with Rishi I'm really disappointed about. There's lots of property companies in the UK that make that sort of money, and other companies, of course, as well. And I think the government had a great opportunity to reduce corporation tax over a period of time to attract more people from Europe and the world to come and work and live in the UK and set businesses up, similar to Ireland. And that does disappoint me. Ireland's 13%, isn't it, Andy, still? Something like that?
It's 12.5%, yeah.
So, you know, I just think that's a real disappointment in this budget.
I think it also represents a significant sea change as well, because we've been in a long period of declining corporation tax rates, and it was only a few years ago actually that we had, you know, one of the famous sort of roadmaps that the government keeps setting out now. I think it was once upon a time advertised that we were going to have a corporation tax rate of 16%. So it's a bit of a, and obviously that I suppose you know, the Chancellor will point out that certain things have happened since then, but it is a bit of a turnaround, certainly. But I think he will. One of the other announcements that kind of leads us on to, but he will look at, he'll perhaps point to things like the capital allowance changes that have been made, you know, including, I suppose, extending the annual investment allowance for capital allowance purposes, but also the very impressive sounding super deduction that he mentioned.
I mean, for a lot of property people, I think that's a red herring, Stephen, because I think, you know, how many of us buy diggers and all the rest of it? It's all right for builders, contractors maybe, but I think for pure out and out property investors and developers, probably not so much.
Andy, there's quite a few measures that have been aimed at helping the high street and the commercial sector of the property market. The rate relief, as you've just mentioned, the capital allowances perhaps with commercial buildings. One figure that we don't seem to be hearing a lot about, we hear about the woes on the high street, we hear about the difficulties of the big property investment companies. What we're not hearing is actually how many of these are turning into liquidations or receiverships. Are the figures higher these days because of COVID?
It's a good question. I'm not directly involved in, I suppose what you're talking about are sort of insolvent type liquidations, not something that I get terribly involved in. But I think anecdotally, I think you know, the kind of talks of zombie companies and, you know, the various sort of life support that the government has provided over the last 12 months, which, regardless of we think it's necessarily targeted in the right area or not, has been substantial, and there has been a lot of financial assistance. But I suppose the real test is when sort of the tubes are pulled out, and whether that will lead to a lot of businesses and I suppose individuals facing bankruptcy and liquidation.
You see, I think the situation is quite a sensitive one, because if we, as members of the public, if we read in the paper that one of the huge property investment companies is not doing too well, we just say, oh well, so what, nothing to do with us, my home's okay. But actually it does matter, because if these companies have invested in the high street shops, for instance, and they're not getting rents, their profits are going down, their dividends are therefore becoming less, and a lot of the big pension funds are of course investing in these type of companies. So it does have a repercussive effect all the way down the line, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think clearly on the high street we have seen some big names bite the dust. I think it suggested that a number of those companies were struggling, as perhaps accelerated the inevitable. You're right that from those businesses, from I suppose tenants simply withholding rent, it's been a tough 12 months for landlords. And you're absolutely right that it's that many of our own sort of pension funds will have a financial interest in.
But yeah, Andy, it's not just pension funds. I mean, I've got shops where I haven't got that many shops, fortunately, but the ones I have got, I've got tenants I can't even contact. They're still not open from last year. They're going to get another grant, by the way, but the property investors aren't. We're not getting another grant, but they are. They're getting another grant to open, and the government they're doing this town fund for across the UK. And Ipswich, for instance, has just announced that they've got a 25 million grant from the government to enhance the town centres. So, I mean, the government are doing everything they can to support town centres. I'm certain of that.
John, let's just come back to the residential side of things. There are measures there, the extended stamp duty holiday.
That, by the way, helps 100,000 people who are currently buying at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we've got, of course, the 5% deposit mortgages, 95% mortgages. Now, you and I have spoken many times about this, and I think we both agree.
Do we?
That, I think so. That the strange day, yes, we do. The ability to be able to fund these purchases is critical to the housing market being sustained and being active, isn't it? I've always said a developer will develop all you like as long as he knows he can sell the product at the end. And to be able to sell it, people need to be able to fund it. So I view that particular measure as particularly helpful, rather more so than the buy to help to buy, which actually I think was more benefit to developers. Than
I think today's great news. The budget's great news for house builders. Let's be honest.
Yes.
You say it hasn't helped to buy, hasn't been that successful. 500,000 people have bought under Help to Buy. Now, you'll say some didn't need to. I know what you're going to say. Some didn't need to, but still, the facts are facts. 500,000. This new scheme, the 95% mortgages, they hope to get 3,000 first-time buyers a month using it. That's a lot of people.
Well, that's great news.
That's great news. And I think what it will do, it will level up the playing field between brand new houses and second-hand ones, because up to now, the second-hand houses, first-time buyer houses and flats, haven't had that support that the new build boys have. So that will even things up a bit. But of course, the stamp duty, and all the rest of these other things is a great incentive for house builders to keep building, which is what the government want.
Yeah. Well, that's good news, especially for the first-time buyers.
Yeah.
And I mean, they are the people that need to have this assistance. I think the government has been slow over the years to realise that every sector of the market needs to be buoyant and working for the whole thing to work.
Yeah.
It's no good freezing one part of the market and supporting
because
another.
Eventually, you're quite right, you know, the first-time buyer buys a second home, the second home buys a third and fourth and so on, and it's a trigger effect, if you like.
Yeah. And Andy, any views on there was some talk before the budget was announced that maybe stamp duty might be scrapped altogether and a sort of blanket property tax brought in. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think first of all, I mean, in the last decade, maybe slightly less than the last decade, maybe more like 8 or 9 years, stamp duty receipts have exponentially risen. I think George Osborne, I would say shrewdly, some people might have a different word to describe it, but he certainly became quickly tuned into the fact he could generate quite a lot of tax revenue from property. And stamp duty has gone from a bit of a sort of quaint little tax backwater to being an incredibly complex and overlapping labyrinthine sort of a jigsaw.
Well, if you don't get it right, you're 20%, aren't you?
well, I mean, stamp duty it's an absolute monster at the moment. So from that perspective, scrapping it as a practitioner would be great, but unfortunately, it's generating so much revenue at the moment. Now, I suppose if you go to Mr. Sunak and say, well, we can get rid of that and we've got something better, some kind of land value tax or something like that, then maybe that would have sort of more about it. But it feels like an awful lot of work bringing in a tax along those lines, and I think particularly at the moment, I just don't see any grand sort of large scale reforms, new taxes really on the agenda. I think probably the most likely one we might have seen would have been some kind of online sales tax, which didn't really seem to, there was no sort of mention of that today. So I really don't see a land value tax or similar being on the to-do list for some time.
No, okay. I mean, I do wonder sometimes what the balance would be. You put stamp duty right up, as Osborne did. By putting it up, you maybe have lessened the amount of sales and transactions. So I wonder if actually one balances out the other, perhaps.
Well, I mean, maybe so, but if you look at it, I mean, because I suppose one prior announcement has been there's another surcharge, of course, coming in next month for non-resident purchases of property. So there's a scenario where if you're an individual buying a property in the UK and you're non-resident, the rate could be 17%. And for me, that's just absolutely astronomical and makes no sense whatsoever. And so I really don't see how any more revenue could be wringed out of stamp duty, land tax. And that's not a challenge, by the way, to the government, but I think we're there. I think we must be at capacity on stamp duty.
I tend to agree.
I'd hope so. I mean, if you look around where we are here in Canary Wharf, many of these big multi-storey developments, 70% have been bought off-plan initially by overseas investors. And of course, whilst you've got property inflation running at maybe 7, 10, 12, 15% even at certain times.
You wish.
Yeah, well, you wish now. You know, that didn't matter too much. But now where you've got very modest inflation in London prices, for instance, I know you're going to tell me off for being too London-centric about it, but whilst you've got very modest inflation of probably 2-3% practically.
Well, the average this year, by the way, the last 12 months is 6.9%. And that includes London not doing that well. 6.9%. Who would have thought that in the COVID situation we've had? It's amazing, really, Andy, isn't it? 6.9%. It's fantastic, really.
Yeah. Okay. Well, coming back to the high street, Andy, these business rates, concessions, do you think they're really going to help? Do you think this new I suppose ethos of borrowings, these bounce back loans are really going to help, or are they just going to aggravate people's situations, getting them further into debt?
It's an interesting question, that isn't it? Because you know these debts do have to be repaid, and it's a tough choice, isn't it? I mean. And you could say that, particularly for those people, maybe let's say, you know, almost 12 months ago, they were taking the decision whether they took on this additional debt, and in their eyes, it may well have been, you know, essentially bridging finance for maybe 3 to 6 months in their mind at the time. But now we're at 12 months. It might be, if you're in the hospitality sector, it might be 15, 16, 18 months. Before you're trading again. So the goalposts have very much changed, and it'd be interesting in maybe a bit macabre, I don't know, but it would be interesting in some scenarios, people who did take on debt at the beginning of the pandemic, whether if they could go back in time, whether they would necessarily do the same again, and perhaps would.
Interesting, Andy, because I mean, they're talking about 1.6 million people have taken out these loans, and they're talking about 35% may not pay them back. So, well, you know, I think a lot of people.
I think the interesting thing there, John, is that these were called bounce back loans last year.
What they're called this year?
Well, that's the point. There was no bounce back. So actually, they've been used to keep people going.
And some people have abused them as well. Well, some people bought new cars on them and all sorts.
Well, I think that's human nature, I'm afraid, isn't it?
I mean, practically, you know, if when you're involved, when you're trying to take out one of these loans, or I suppose you're someone who occasionally has the misfortune of getting involved in them for clients, is that there is a huge difference between the bounce back loan and the C-bills, the business interruption loan, and that's quite simply because the bounce back loan is 100% underwritten by the government. So basically, if you can spell your name correctly on an application for a bounce back loan, you seem to be able to get one with, as far as I can see, no checks whatsoever. So I suspect there has been terrible abuse in regards there. The CBILS, despite the fact they are 80% underwritten by the government, the banks seem incredibly reluctant to lend money. So you find that it's the good lending sort of cases get the money, and those that really actually do need the money because their business has been adversely impacted, the banks don't want to know because they've got 20% on the hook. So I don't think it's worked particularly well myself. So I think it could do with doing a little bit of work in that area.
So do you see, so somebody's got a bounce back loan from last year. The Chancellor's just announced that there will be new loans available this year, 80% underwritten by the government. Does that mean that these firms that had a bounce back loan will be able to go back and say, can I have another one please, but only 80% of it will be guaranteed, or is it going to be more complex than that?
I think thus far where they have extended, for example, the bounce back loan, you've been able to top up. So if you're able to lend a little bit more, I think it was 25% of turnover, you could lend. If that amount goes up under the new rules, you'd be able to top up, I would imagine. So, essentially apply for a loan of any excess. And I suspect you would you would get through that process relatively straightforwardly.
Okay. I mean, your reference to the original forms for the bounce back, I think it takes us back to the days of self-certification for a mortgage, doesn't it?
Well, it was. It absolutely was self-certification. You didn't have to provide. Certainly, the ones that I've looked at with clients, you didn't have to even provide accounting information. You basically just essentially put in your number, and clearly there's a declaration where you tick all the boxes saying, this is 25% of my turnover, blah blah blah. But there were no proper sort of checks and balances as far as I could see.
No.
Okay, well, look, gentlemen, I think finally what we're going to do is this. I'm going to ask you, Andy, for your view, from the accountancy point of view and the sort of professional money and number cruncher, what you think the future holds over the next 2 years after having listened to this budget, which is supposed to be a budget to regenerate our economy and get us back on track?
I mean, for me, a budget with no surprises is a good budget, and I think probably the weeks and weeks of sort of drip feeding all the substantive provisions probably sort of conditions as well for that. So there's nothing surprising in there. And when I say I don't just mean in the actual speech itself. It's having a look through the documents that are published alongside the budget. It's a trite saying, but the devil is in the detail. And certainly the documents have been published by the time I got on this call. There wasn't anything particularly concerning or surprising in there, so that's a good thing. I mean, it is difficult. I do have some sympathy with the Chancellor. It's not an easy position for him to be in. Clearly, politically, and I'm not quite sure why it works this way, but he's kind of has a bit of a straitjacket from the manifesto. I suppose the heavy lifters in terms of tax receipts, our income tax, our national insurance contributions, and his VAT. So probably 60-70% of tax is raised through those taxes. So to say that you're not going to increase them really does kind of cut him off a little bit at the knees. Now, I think probably the intellectually mature thing to do would be for them to come back and say, you know what, we did make this promise in the manifesto, but clearly we weren't anticipating a pandemic that caused the economy to be closed down for 12 months. All bets are off. We're going to look at this again with a fresh pair of eyes. But sadly, that's not the way that politics seems to work anymore. Whether it's ever worked like that, I don't know.
John,
but it's difficult, and I don't, as I say, looking at it from a practitioner's point of view of my clients, I don't think there'll be any sort of major concerns, because I think we've been conditioned for a number of weeks. I think one of the real positives for clients will be no change in capital gains tax has been scheduled. So I think a lot of people would be very happy about that. so they get to live to fight another day on that.
You might be, Andy, but I'm not happy about the corporation tax, I can assure you.
Andy, thank you for that. John,
Yes.
your view then in the last minute or so, your view of the property market
Yeah.
and the effect on it of this budget.
Well, interestingly, the property market over the last 12 months seems to have been ring-fenced from the economy.
Yeah.
But what have we got to remember? There's 700,000 people out of work. There's 4.3 million people who are on furlough. At some point, it's going to wash through, and there's going to be a lot of people out unemployed. It's 6% at the moment. It could go to 10, who knows? But unfortunately, those aren't the sort of people, seem to be, that are buying property anyway. Most of those people. You know, they're the bottom end of the, you know, the sort of people, the younger people who are working in restaurants and so on. So I have a feeling that the property market's going to get away with it with the support from the government. And of course, remember, the government know that if someone buys a property, they're much more likely to vote Tory than they are Labour.
Yes, I think you're right. And of course, we mustn't forget that buying a property does put a lot of money into the economy.
Sure.
There's furniture, there's refurbishments,
absolutely,
decorating.
Paint, decorating, you name it.
Yeah, great. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much. So, Andy from ETC Tax, thank you very much for your contribution.
It's a pleasure, thank you.
And John Howard, thank you for your contribution as ever on Property
Thank you.
TV. So that's Property Matters, that's our budget special. Join me again next time on Property Matters.